You've come to the wrong shop for anarchy, brother.
I feel the plot about to thicken.
You ever get that sinking feeling? You know, the one that you feel you've only heard maybe half the story? Or even a different story altogether? Hello and welcome to the Red Pill Diary. I'm Lewis, and I'll be your host. So, ready or not, let's flip the switch and shed some light on it. The frigid westerly wind blew down the East River. The older gentleman, his snow-white beard covering the better portion of his weathered face, stood with his back to the wind. He folded his papers, tucked them inside his woolen jacket, and pulled up his collar to protect his neck and ears from the icy blast. It was the typical overcast and gray skies for New York this time of year. The atrophied wharves were abustle with dock hands and cargo being loaded onto ships, efficiency cloaked in chaos. Following a colder than usual winter and the floating slabs of ice that clogged and choked the East River for months now began to retreat, bringing life back to the docks. In front of him and awaiting the tide was a 360-ton, copper-bottomed, three-masted, square-rigged merchant ship, formerly built as a privateer named China Queen, now fully refitted and renamed the Empress of China. His ship, loaded with cargo, crawling with gangs of crew members, now busily stowed geared and prepared for sailing, and awaited the arrival of their captain and the tide. John Green pulled his hat tightly over his ears, pulled the pipe from his coat pocket, and began walking to the gangplank. The supercargo and visitors of influence, who were scheduled to arrive shortly, and he wanted to be prepared to greet them accordingly. His crew, a seasoned lot, were loosing the sails in their buntlines and set things to rights. Once we're all aboard and things were stowed, he would give the orders and set sail on this maiden voyage of the Empress of China from New York to Canton, China. It was George Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1784. All right, before we go on, this is my 17th episode. And for those following, I wanted to say I appreciate your feedback and joining in on a weekly basis. It's been a couple weeks since the last episode, but I've been taking in consideration the response to the feedback. And, I'll try to ease back a bit on the chalking the one episode of 20 minutes or less filled with dates, facts, people. So I'm going to turn it just a little bit. I'm going to try to run a string of episodes and break it up. That way it's easier to digest and kind of get the thread that's going on. So now I have gone back to 1794, and there is a reason. Well, there better be, right? It's in the backstory, or the beginning, of this rabbit trail. Bon voyage. So let's set the backstory for this episode. Now, at the time the Empress of China set sail in 1784, the country had a sense of newfound national pride and identity. The Americans were eager to establish themselves as an independent nation, of course, in the global arena. America was hungry for trade opportunities, for economic independence and growth, moving away from the British economic control. Now, this is the age of enlightenment, so there was this strong interest in exploration, science, and discovery, which extended to the curiosity about cultures and civilizations, particularly Asia. Now, we'll see this interest driving a lot of exploration and discussion in the new formation of this country. Think about Jefferson and think about the founders and what they were doing this period of time. Now, this voyage represented an informal diplomatic gesture because this is their first time to go to Asia. Now, they wanted to showcase America's interest in peaceful trade and cultural exchange. They really didn't want to be seen as coming as a conquest. That's in contrast to the European colonialism. Now, although it's limited, there was this desire for cultural exchange because the Americans were fascinated by the exotic goods and stories that they heard from the merchants and sailors that had returned from Asia that were associated with the trade during the colonial times. And that influenced Americans' tastes and perceptions. So that gave us a backdrop. Now, recognize this is like 4 months after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, and America was faced with significant economic challenges. I mean, think about the Revolutionary War and the expenses, the damage to the economy. I mean, Britain was fighting on our soil. So those challenges, and they were striving after this successful revolution. They wanted to be identified as a sovereign nation. They were independent states. They were economically struggling and recovering from all these war debts. And they really they lacked a hard currency. That led to, like we see now, economic instability. Now, the Continental Congress had issued some paper money, which that paper money, fiat currency, what does it do when you rapidly print it? It depreciates and prompts an economic distress like inflation. So the Article of Confederations, that was the first attempt to form a federal government. Well, essentially a national government. And it provided very little federal power to regulate commerce, resulting in trade problems between the states. The interesting fact about these continental dollars, they were called continentals. What's interesting, they had these designs that had various symbols of liberty, like mind your own business coin. Now we need some of those today. I'll give you a coin that says, mind your own business, it had the inscription like Fugio, like means to fly in Latin, kind of like time flies. I'm really having a hard time struggling how that relates to the Revolutionary War. But hey, I get the one that says we are one, reflecting unity. But, that reverse side of these coins, these dollars, still had that mind your own business with an image of a sundial. Now, I don't understand how mind your own business and a sundial match, but that's what they had. That was found that interesting to see a sundial and, mind your own business. I need that on my car. That's what you need. You need one of those on your car. I mean, can you imagine the dollar bill now? You make a new dollar bill on the back and it says you give it to somebody in another country. Just mind your own business. Boy, that's some really good advice. So these coins, they were meant to fund the war, but the problem was they depreciated so rapidly due to the overprinting. That sounds like today. It's like no gold or silver backing. Well, hello. So it came to learn this phrase, not worth a continental. Basically, we use it today. It means describe something of very little value. Like when you walk down the sidewalk, you see a pentel. You see a penny. That's not worth a continental. I mean, I can remember as a kid, a penny would buy you a lot, but it sure isn't buying nothing now. So now back to the political aspects. The country is under this weak central government of Articles of Confederation. It created this uncertainty between these states. So they needed a strong federal structure. That was evident, but they still feared, obviously coming out from being controlled by a monarchy, this central power. It lingered, and it still does. And you know what? It still does today. You see what's happening? Everybody, just think this week. What are they alleging? Centralized power problem? I mean, that's the first thing they go to. Why? Because it's in our nation's DNA. So this colonial time, this struggle for independence and not being controlled by this strong entity. In this case, England was a monarchy, but even now, see what happens, what's going on. So there's this pressure to prove to the world, particularly Europe, that the United States could thrive without British control. It had to show and affirm its independence. So establishing trade was critical for economic recovery, especially in light of the mind your own business continentals. Since they're a new player, they wanted to bypass British trade restrictions, which was good because now they had to engage directly with global markets to do that. But it wasn't about economic gain necessarily, but it also was about demonstrating to the people of the country that America could stand independently. Now, this is a big deal because 1812 comes up and that becomes a real teetering point. So they wanted to foster national pride and they wanted to build diplomatic relations with other countries. And so there was a rush towards this international trade and a move towards economic independence and the declaration that America was present on the world stage. Now I want to turn to the kind of a real brief. I promised I gave a brief with a lot of people's names, but it's important that who were the cast of characters that provided the venture capital and the conception of this venture. So in the late 18th century, this is, of course, we're talking post-Revolutionary War. And because they're eager to establish themselves, they had to look for somebody who had the ability to finance this. In those days, they had syndicates. A syndicates really was just a group of people, financiers, business people, that would get together and put the venture capital together to do this venture. You see syndicates now today in insurance, like in London, the London Syndicate, for example. So they looked to a person by the name of Robert Morris. He was also known as the financier of the Revolution. He was not only a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but he was also a prominent Philadelphia merchant. Now, we'll see his name pop up in future episodes. Alongside these other investors like Daniel Parker, John Holker. Morris saw the potential, all of them did, the potential for opening trade with China. Now, we're going to talk about the next episode, this individual that gave him the spark, even though they're giving him the credit of opening trade with China, but the spark came from another person, which will come in the next episode. So they needed a market that before was close to the Western trade due to the British East India Company, their dominance, and as a colony, their inability to get there. The one thing they saw as part of this venture was ginseng, as that was the primary export to China. They thought that was strategic because ginseng, a root that's highly valued in Chinese medicine for its supposed health benefits, was abundant in America, especially in the regions like the Appalachian Mountains. The merchants recognized that ginseng could be harvested at a low cost and sold in China at a very high profit margin due to its rarity. The other thing that they were concerned about in this venture was avoiding British trade routes. Just because the war was over doesn't necessarily mean everybody's friendly. So they were trying to avoid British trade routes, and that was a strategy that's critical for this venture. And the British, through the East India Company, had monopolized trade with China, and American merchants sought to bypass this control and wanted to establish direct trade. The decision was not necessarily about economic competition, although that was important, but also a statement to us being independent. By navigating around the British restrictions, these merchants aimed to show that the United States could conduct its own foreign commerce free of British oversight. Now, the Empress of China, they outfitted for this journey, was not just a commercial venture, but a symbol of Americans' ambition to partake in global trade on its own terms and showcasing entrepreneurial spirit and nationalistic pride in the face of European economic dominance. So there's a lot of this, not just free from British control, but free to expand and show a new nation that was able to do its thing despite European dominance. This venture, this voyage of the Empress, it was led by a Major Samuel Shaw. Now, this was an epic undertaking. Basically, the hopes of the country, promises of trade, but it was perilous. Especially in the 18th century, maritime travel was very dangerous. Now, even though Samuel Shaw was a former military officer, he was now a merchant, and he served as the supercargo. He was responsible for the commercial negotiations. Now, the journey from New York to Guangzhou, now called Canton, was very difficult. It covered about 18,000 miles, which typically took about 6 months on these ships, due to the necessity of navigating around Cape of Good Hope in Africa. The intention is to avoid the British routes through the Indian Ocean. The crew faced unpredictable weather, especially storms around the Cape of Good Hope, and it required skilled navigation. Just think about navigating today in a sailboat. This is a big ship, but they didn't have GPS. Sustaining the crew with fresh water was a problem because they needed a constant supply. And it was a constant concern with stops and supplies like the Cape Verde Islands or the Dutch settlement at the Cape of Good Hope. And diseases like scurvy were a threat, mitigated, to some extent by carrying citrus fruits, but they ran out. That was still a concern. Now, think back about 3 episodes, why Hawaii became important. And this is one of the reasons. And there were others, and we'll get to them in other episodes, but that's one of them. The big thing was a cultural shock. When they got to Canton, upon their arrival, this was profound cultural shock coming from the colonies, now the Americas, the United States, to now Asia. Nobody had been there. It was the only port open in all of China to foreign trade under the Jing dynasty, and they had very restrictive policies. For example, foreigners were confined to 13 factory areas. There are small districts where they could trade, but were otherwise isolated from Chinese society. Language barriers, of course, were significant, with the trade conducted through intermediaries known as Hong merchants, who spoke some English or Portuguese. The American traders were introduced to Chinese business practice, social customs, and a very rigid legal system, which included severe punishment for foreigners. And we're going to get into this in another episode, as evidenced by the Lady Hughes incident, where a British sailor was executed for manslaughter, and it had to do with firing a cannon and a salute. So we'll get into that when it comes to a future episode. Now, Shaw documented his whole journey through his journals, and it's published, the Journals of Major Samuel Shaw. Now, you can find it on the Internet Archive. It's an interesting read if you're interested in maritime and this era of opening the trade between America and China. In this journal, he noted everything from the sights and sounds of Canton to the intricacies of those trade negotiations he had. So he wrote this all down. His records kind of reflects his really wanting to do is to navigate these diplomatic landscapes. And he's kind of like the de facto diplomat in absence of any formal American representative. He was essentially the first American diplomat in that area. These writings essentially give you this fascination he had with Chinese culture, which they had no experience in. And if you've ever been to a foreign culture, if it's European in nature, you have some familiarity. But if you go to something that's totally different than yours, it kind of throws you off. Now, the reason why these things are all important is because this episode is setting the stage for future episodes that we're going to go through in dealing with this merging of government interest and economic interest through companies or ventures that provides access to other sovereign nations that would not have been available except for this economic trade interaction. The merging of this merchant's interest with U.S. government objectives in the context of Empress of China, we've seen in the previous episode, it did have governmental endorsement. All that was a private commercial venture. It had the backing of significant figures in the new government, including Robert Morris, who financed it. And the U.S. Congress also showed its support by appointing Samuel Shaw as an unofficial consul, indicating a blend of private enterprise with government interest. Now, the success of the Empress of China influenced U.S. foreign policy. One of the big things that with this merger was what they termed soft power, the presence of American traders in China, and we'll see this in other countries, helped lay the groundwork for cultural exchange and soft diplomacy, as these merchants acted as informal ambassadors, influencing and being influenced, in this case, by Chinese culture. Over time, this helped shape U.S. foreign policy towards a more engaged stance in Asia, but it also taught them how to intervene into a country with economic trade in order to open the door for more influence based on that trade. The government also, began to support the protection of American shipping interests, include naval actions against piracy, negotiation for safe trade routes, and aligning their military strategy with commercial objectives. So you see, I started here for this reason, to show you the Empress voyage right after the Revolutionary War was the Treaty of Paris. This is the point where you see the United States government merging or having this symbiotic relationship with an economic interest for the benefit of this soft power. Over time, this evolves into our government policy actively supported and sometimes was directed by merchants' interest, especially Asia. Now, we saw this in previous episodes and things like the United Fruit Company in Guatemala. So, trade becomes a pillar of foreign policy. So this Empress of China is going to set a precedent that helps cement trade as a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, and it still is. The government began at this place initially to see the strategic importance of trade relationships in an international relationship, led to different policies with open trade, protectionism, and eventually the open door policy in China, which sought equal trade and opportunities for all nations in China. The voyage of the Empress marked the beginning of this relationship, where economic interests not only aligned, but are also shaped by our national policy. And that led to the legacy where trade and commerce became integral to U.S. diplomatic and expansionist strategies. Now, we are going to see this going forward because it's going to take us to a point where if you go back to the previous episodes, this will start to make sense. We see it happening today. Now, there's a person that we're going to bring up next episode. His name is John Ledyard. He's important not just for this episode, but for future episodes, and he will tie in with a couple previous episodes. With that, I'll leave the lights on for you.
Well, we filled those pages. If you have comments, suggestions, share them. The more input, the more likely a better outcome. I'm moving forward because backwards is not an option. I've turned the lights on here, and I'll be leaving them that way. Join me next time on The Red Pill Diary.